Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you are listening to this. I am CT Folly Entropy, but you can just call me Entropy, and I welcome you to the third episode of my side podcast called Lit, or just Lit Literature. And I'm just going to jump right into it because I actually have a lot to say. I'll just pick right back up where it's kind of going to be a secondary part to introducing the book Praise of Folly, because in the last one, I was kind of introducing it as a general whole, but now I have a ton of more details to give concerning the history. The introduction where I got all these details was written by A.H.T. Levi, and I must say, holy cow, dude, you gotta change your writing style. I don't know what it is, but he would have like paragraphs that are like one sentence and they're incredibly wordy, and they at times made absolutely no sense. And you have to just reread it again and again and again for it to actually start making sense in your brain. I ended up writing like a 3-page paragraph, just like 3 full pages to trying to comprehend all the information on it. And then I wrote a very consolidated 2 paragraphs just for me to understand it. Like, that took me way longer than it should have been. I should have been able to at least write something after the first read. Whatever. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, of course, like I said, Praise of Folly was written as a kind of indirect criticism of the major church at the time that ended up bringing around the Reformation that was kind of led by Luther. But it gives details that Luther ended up kind of becoming radical and moving away from the traditional values they were trying to originally place in the church because of that Reformation, and they kind of fell back into their corruption again, unfortunately. Otherwise, let's start way back. So a lot of this kind of began in the 13th century, whereas Erasmus with his book was in the 15th century. But in the 13th century, these 2 topics have started to be debated quite heavily, and the main 2 was the salvation of pagans and unreached tribes, which also brought up the topic of predestination and the possible ways for pagans and unreached tribes to somehow save themselves, to somehow get eternal salvation. And some of those beliefs, theories, doctrines picked up speed and obscured the system of beliefs that were in place in the main church at the time. And then the second one is a more general topic on the soul salvation, now with the pagans this time, but with that, many different doctrines arise from that as well. And those are ones we see today in modern Lutheranism and Catholicism. But otherwise, where this lands with Erasmus is that he had picked up on beliefs that were Platonic as in a religious sect of philosophers who affirm the existence of abstract objects and are sometimes called Platonists, and those who deny their existence are sometimes called nominalists. Yes, I already had that pre-written because I wasn't going to remember that, alright? There's a lot of these weird religious sectors and groups in this time that have such specific set of beliefs that they stood for that good luck remembering all of them anyway. So he had a few beliefs from them, but at the same time he had a few beliefs in how do you pronounce it? Enchiridion. Okay, yeah. The Enchiridion is an appeal on Christians to act in accordance with the Christian faith rather than merely performing the necessary rites, which it became one of Erasmus' most influential works. Alright, so what ended up happening to Erasmus because of these 2 beliefs, where there was part of the Reformation where he agreed because of an attempt to upheave the current corruption of the church, while he also had just his personal beliefs in some of the beliefs of Plato. That's what Platonists. Oh my gosh, I can't even pronounce the word. Platonists are, where he had some beliefs that he got from Plato. And what ended up happening is that because he had these 2 sides, neither one liked him, because he wrote things that definitely expressed that he had these mixed views between the 2 groups. And when he wrote the Praise of Folly in criticism of the current church, that kind of edged it in stone. That was the nail in the coffin for him that confirmed him that put him apart from the scholars, because he wanted to be a scholar himself. But because of his work here, which was seen as incredibly unprofessional because of how metaphorical and how satirical it was, it set him apart from ever being a scholar because of his unprofessional work. And at the same time, he had Platonic beliefs that set him apart from Luther and his movement. And he really did not want to go against Martin Luther then, but he ended up having to pick up the pen and start debating with him eventually. And that, of course, set him apart from the reformists as well that Martin Luther was leading. The Praise of Folly was just kind of him holding his ground right there in the middle, being completely disliked from either side that was wanting him to choose really one or the other. And in writing Praise of Folly, he was just there. And that's what makes this incredibly interesting, because he ended up giving up the career he wanted and even the people that he wasn't originally enemies with just because he wrote this book. And he's continued to even defend it in letters. So yes, there we go. There's so many more details. There's a ton of details of how these two different sides and how their beliefs ended up evolving into why either side even had the belief. And there's actually one I will note. You've probably heard the phrase before. It's called platonic love. It's kind of used in romance media, like modern romance media, kind of cliche, but it's been completely redefined as incredibly sappy now. But originally it was actually from one of Plato's writing called Symposium. Yes, the book was called Symposium, and it was this... Man, I don't know if he meant it like to heart or if it was kind of supposed to be some metaphorical analogy, but it was saying the soul is alienated in space, and to reach this perfectionism, to be eternally with God, it slowly has this developing connection through love of and expressing this love through music and art. So yeah, in a lot of media today, you could use it in the context, unfortunately, because it's been so derived of any spiritualism at this point, because I don't think anyone knows anything about where the phrase came from, that it's very much used in the context of modern romance stuff, where it's like, it could be, I don't know, some parasocial relationship where one person just constantly sends poetic letters to one other woman, and you could call it platonic love, simply because he's just expressing his love in the form of an art, poems, writing. Anyway, that was really the only noteworthy thing. Otherwise, everything else was kind of just unjustified, no rhyme or reason, beliefs that people were just bringing up and just throwing out there like, hey, this is a possibility, without any backup to it. So it made this reading and just incredibly confusing. Otherwise, that's it for Praise of Folly. Now moving on to Ethics, which I may, whether I actually feel like it or not by the end of this, whether I feel like it or not, merging into government. But with Ethics, I just read 6 more pages, and that was really all I needed to do. So Bonhoeffer, in his book Ethics, from pages 24 to 30, he describes shame, the difference between shame and consciousness. Bonhoeffer describes shame as a man's apparent awareness being separated from God, and the fact that this disunion is man's fault, a shame to what is lost is there. But this can cause a motivation for reunion. He explains that. But then he describes consciousness, and he's very thorough about this. He says, consciousness is different. It's a consciousness not of their status with God, but himself. His insecurity by their own sin, and is shameful only of themselves. Bonhoeffer continues with saying that a conscious man has selfishly taken upon himself the role of God in deciding what is good and what is bad, looking at himself, who is said by God to be good when created, and conscientiously says, I'm bad. The man is inherently sinful, yes, but he took it further to look at God's creation being himself and labeling it bad. I found this insanely interesting. Because personally, as a believer myself, I have personally dealt with insecurities. And reading that, that's kind of direct addressment. But it's really a good way to think about it. Because in that way, God sees us as created in his image. And what right do I have to look at myself with such shame and insecurity to be like, ew, why do I look like this? What do you mean, why do you look like this? God made you to look this way. And personally, I don't know if that can seem kind of downing for people, but personally, it's just kind of a very hard and solid truth that with believing in God is very true. Now, that was all he had talked about in 6 pages, and I summarized pretty quickly because I'm assuming I've already been talking forever. But I'll segue quickly into government, because with ethics, a lot of it's about morality, and something that really got me thinking, like I always do, is that there's a lot of political discourse. It's kind of the touchy topic no one wants to speak about, and I was thinking about it, and there will always be political discourse, but how can there not be? In the realms of at least our government system, when it comes to authority, there's kind of these main things of authority. And that is, the authority of the home, your family, the church for some people, not all people, the state, which is, of course, our government, and school, which of course takes up like 12 years of our life. So yeah, it's quite an authority in our lives to our development and our likelihood. But all of this goes very much hand in hand. Do you know the reason why we even have public education? Like, why does the government even care enough to fund these schools to host our dumb little butts in these things? Yeah, well, the reason is because with having a government where things are chosen by the people, the public education, the reason why the government even has it in the first place is because they need to have an educated and intelligent populace of people to actually vote for their betterment. So they do it for the interest of the government. Sure, the government controls the people, but the people control the government. And I feel like that's forgotten. Like the government just controls us and there's nothing we can do about it. But we're the one appointing them, from the lowest level to the highest level. So it's very confusing when I see a lot of the political discourse, where of course the only reason is who we're voting in, and people argue over who we should vote in. But really, government is about governing the morals of the people. What is right and what is wrong. Now, it relates back to what I was talking about with ethics, where man took it upon themselves to decide what is good and what is bad. Now, I believe that the origin of America was definitely established on Christian principles. And yes, I know the founding fathers themselves weren't that good of people, but that is not really much of an argument for saying that they still didn't derive a lot of the principles in like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, from Christian principles. Literally, when you look at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, a lot of the rights we have are Christian principles if you really compare them. Sure, it probably also relates to maybe principles in Stoicism for all I know, but Christian principles nonetheless. And the reason for that is because they knew that they argued all the freaking time when with their letters back and forth when they were making the Constitution and the starting of their government. They knew that they couldn't really take it upon themselves to govern the people. They were looking at all the past governments in the world and were seeing that it all just led in dictatorships, or just they tried, or even anarchy, and that ended up making a small scale version of worldwide governments anyway, because in a situation where there is anarchy, there's going to be leaders of groups anyway, where you just realize you have common beliefs in this chaos. And then even on the other side, where everyone chooses one leader and they end up being a dictator because that one person has no standard. The only reason that a lot of the a lot of political discourse even happens is because there's no universal standard. And that's what the founding fathers were trying to do, was trying to place the universal standard on what was good on God. Because they said everything good comes from God. And the fall of man, of course, was the one that brought down free will. I think it's not really good and bad, it's more like good and free will. Our free will being inherently evil and our flesh. But until we have a universal set of beliefs in place when it comes to what is good and what is wrong, when it comes to governing the morals of the people and a government, there will always be problems, there will always be conflict, and even yet, we couldn't ever set something up that kind of feels like it works for everyone, because you can never set anything morally that universally works for everyone. It's kind of the topic when it comes up to gay marriage, because it's like, who has the right to say if same-sex marriage is allowed, because there's no standard of truth, because to everyone truth is subjective. So then it's like, so there's nothing to base off of. We have nothing to go off of. Some people say it's good, some people say it's bad, and there's no one else to check it. There's a system of checking that's kind of implemented through the entire government, and that's why there's a small scale checking all the way up to the Supreme Court, where it's just this hierarchy of checking one another. But if they have nothing to check each other off of, there's no reason at all. I don't think people are realizing that, and that's kind of why I'm informing people that this universal standard needs to be required when it comes to making rules, or we will never go anywhere. And at this point, our government, as of right now, is so corrupt that I see the only way to ever fix it is from completely tearing it down and building up from the roots with some type of religion that just ends up being agreed on by the mass population at the time. But anyway, I've gone on long enough. That's all I have to say, and I thank you for listening. Bye.